Hi everyone, welcome to Lilith Mag. Today we're bringing you Feminist City and Economy, Meeting of the Minds. My name is Hasna El Maroudi, I'm a journalist, I'm a program maker and the co-founder of Lilith Mag. And today we're talking with two amazing feminists, Dr. Leslie Kern and Enaam Ahmed Ali. We're going to be talking about Feminist City and Economy and what a feminist city should look like. What needs to change in the public space to make that possible? And today is all about visualizing and exchanging between two feminist minds and professionals. A few notes before we start. This is an initiative by Lilith Mag, a feministic journalistic platform. And it's part of the series City for Change program by the Amsterdam municipality, in which all kinds of organizations, activists, citizens think about what a socio-economical just city looks like. Be sure to check out our previous talk. It was hosted by Lilith Mag co-founder Gladys Gargar, and she speaks with her guests about climate change, about poverty, about care and welfare, and housing shortages and accessibility. As I said before, today's theme is the feminist city and economy. Eventually, we will be creating a grassroots New Deal, a code or a vision for the future of the city, and it will encompass input from all the different talks that we have had. And because we so often talk about what we don't want to see in the world, we thought it would be good to now imagine what we do want to see in the world. You can tweet, tag, and share our talks using hashtag LilithMag or hashtag FeministCity to create a buzz, but also to let us know what you want to see in the world and what you want to see in your city. So, let's start. As I said, today I have two amazing international guests with me, virtually joining me here in Felix Meritis. The first one is Leslie Kern. She is the author of 2 books on gender and cities, including Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World. She is an associate professor of geography and environment and director of the Women's and Gender Studies at Mount Allison University in Sackville, New Brunswick, Canada. I said Sackville, it's Sackville. Hi Leslie, so great for you to join us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, so your latest book is called Feminist City, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World. You're currently working on a new book on gentrification. For the viewers that aren't already familiar with your previous work, can you tell us a little bit about what you've done, what you've written, and how you came to do so?
Sure. So I came to the world of geography through an interest in how women live in cities, how women experience cities, and what some of the challenges for women in day-to-day life are. So I discovered, I guess, or found this whole world of feminist geography, which is all about trying to understand how power relations, including those related to gender, are kind of built into our urban environments, and then how those environments in turn affect social relations across all sorts of factors: gender, race, class, ability, age, sexuality, and so on. So in my book, Feminist City, I wanted to bring some of those ideas kind of into a mainstream conversation, to encourage people to look at the cities around them, the places where they live, where they travel to, where they work, in a different way, and to maybe think about some of the things that we just take for granted. You know, the subway runs at this time and in this direction, or this building is located in this particular place. This space is open and this space is closed, and to maybe start asking why, right? And to start to question a little bit more the nature of this space that we've created around us, in order to kind of stop seeing it as maybe something that is just common sense or something that's always been there, but more like an active participant in all sorts of social relations and power imbalances. Mm-hmm. So over the last year, I've had lots of great conversations with feminist organizations, also with architects and planners, and it's great to be here today to think a little bit more about what the kind of intersections of an idea of a feminist economy and a feminist city are all about.
Yeah, thank you. I think that just the question why is so important. It can open your eyes into the way the world is constructed, and give you answers that you may not had thought about if you didn't ask the question why, which is a very simple question to ask. Yeah. My second guest is Enaam Ahmed Ali. Enaam is the Dutch UN Women's Representative for 2022. Congratulations, Enaam, that has just been announced, I think, last week. You're also an a board member for UN Women Netherlands and Women's March Netherlands. And usually you reside here in the Netherlands, but at the moment you're in Thailand because of your work. I was wondering when I saw the announcement that you are our UN Women's Representative in 2022. If you've already thought about what your key message will be when going to New York and speaking on behalf of all women in the Netherlands, or is that something that you will be figuring out along the way?
Thank you so much, Hasna, for having me here today. Yes, I think the themes are clear for next year, and I'll be focusing on climate change and technology and the intersection between that and women's rights. But the actual message and what we want to share there at the stage at the UN General Assembly, I will have to, and I want to structure together with all the women that I'll be speaking to in the upcoming year to really get the input from there as well, and to see what is front of mind and what is important for women, not just in the Netherlands, but worldwide when it comes to these themes, but also beyond them. And this theme is incredibly important because we see that climate change is becoming more and more of a pressing issue. We have about 9 years to make sure that we don't go over that threshold of 1.5 to 2 degrees, which is actually a very short amount of time to make such an immense change together as a world and as a planet. At the other end, we have technology, which was actually one of the main drivers for creating this huge challenge and problem of climate change, but can also be very much an important lever and tool to be able to actually combat it and create solutions around it. And these two themes, they go hand in hand because they amplify the structural problems we have within the women's rights movements, and they make them worse if we don't take them into account and we don't solve them. I hope to also bring that perspective today with us to the conversation we have today about feminist cities.
Because when you talk about climate change and technology, the first thing that pops in my mind when talking about technology is how little women work in technology. But how does being a woman play a role within climate change, or when you intertwine the two?
I think it's similar to what Leslie was mentioning, right? When you have male-dominated sectors or industries, the gendered lens is not taken into account. A man doesn't know that a city is unsafe because he doesn't feel unsafe every time he walks through a city, right, at night. The same goes for climate change and technology. And I think a very concrete example is the algorithms that we're currently using and are being developed, whether it's in the HR sector or in self-driving cars. We see a bias there arising as well, because we have been biased as a community, as a society. And these biases are basically part of that code, part of that data that they're being trained on, part of everything, because it's inherently us. And we have this idea of, for example, for technology, of being perfect, but as long as we are not perfect, we can't ask that. of the technology either. And if we have more women, but also people of color and more diversity in these sectors, we can raise awareness on it, but we can also find it, right? I think one of the main, very concrete examples of this is shown in the documentary Coded Bias, but it was only found out that some algorithms have biases by a Black woman when she wanted to use them in her project. So it's very important to have this diversity and this lens as well.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting you. She actually had to put on a white mask to be able to use that program. Yeah. And I believe that her name, the author Gabriela Prado Perez, wrote a book about how all these biases work within everywhere actually in society. When it comes to the temperature of the rooms we're in, that women are always cold, but it's not because we're actually always cold, but because our temperature differs from the men's temperature, and all temperatures in buildings are set lower to accommodate the men. So there are all these different things.
They're also set lower because men usually wear suits, right? So it's much hotter for them, and especially in summer, that's a problem because women wear less clothing then, even in corporate environments, and while men continue to wear suits. So it's fascinating to see just how much of an impact this has on our day-to-day lives without people recognizing it.
Yeah. What a great introduction already to this talk. We've invited you both to talk to us about what a feminist economy and city looks like, and to see if we can somehow translate it into practical tools to create a more inclusive Amsterdam, and to work towards steps to reach this goal. In the first part of our conversation, we will be talking about the issues or the problems, as we have already laid out a little bit in this introduction. In the second part, we will be showing our perspectives on what that future should look like if it was up to us. And to finalize, in the third part of this conversation, we want to take a deep dive into the hows and answer the question of how we can realize that future. Leslie, to come back to you, you've written, I already said so, extensively on that man-made world and what it's like to navigate that world as a woman. And you've also used the term intersectional and intersectionality a little bit in the introduction, because somehow we always tend to focus on men and women and the binaries, but there are also a lot of different other factors that you can take into account when it comes to being safe or even just feeling free to move around in cities. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So my vision behind the Feminist City is not to simply replace the sort of universal standard male who's been held up as the norm in design with just a female version of that who would embody, in fact, many of the same privileges that sort of mythical male figure has, but rather to take this intersectional perspective, which is both a way of understanding how different sets of power relations, sexism, racism, classism, colonialism, and so on, work together to structure the experiences of people in different ways. And sometimes those systems lend us power and privilege, and sometimes they oppress and constrain us. And all of us experience a kind of unique mix of the impacts of those systems. So for me, Feminist City has to be about taking that intersectional approach to trying to see how any given policy, practice, plan, design is going to impact different groups in the city differently. One way to think about this is to, ask, well, who are the people who are sort of typically most excluded or experiencing the most marginalization or harm or violence in a given society, neighborhood, city, and to think about what would actually make improvements for them, because I do believe that then those changes kind of trickle up, and so that people who have more power and privilege will also benefit from those changes, but we have to kind of start from the margins, if you will, rather than simply trying to expand the center ever so incrementally by, including women first, and then, okay, women of color, and then, okay, queer women. And we just kind of make these little tiny moves that don't ultimately change the status quo very much. But what if we actually started from the margins and tried to plan, design, imagine from that perspective? I think we would make much greater strides towards the kind of changes that we want to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nice. And while writing your book and doing your research, you just said we need to move away from what is the status quo. What were the typical things that you encountered that maybe blew your mind, or maybe didn't really blow your mind, but still made you go, why is the world designed the way it is?
Well, just as you were just mentioning, some of the man-made design elements of the city, so the physical infrastructure of the city, the way that it has been set up, not only with a typical kind of male body in mind, so things like, yes, office temperatures, whether you can reach the hand bar on the subway system to hold on a busy train, or accessibility features that radically kind of change the way that you move through the urban environment if, for example, you're pushing a stroller. But also the way that so much of our infrastructure has been set up around what is assumed to be a typical man's life, the notion of the kind of 9-to-5 breadwinner commuting from the residential areas into the central city for work in this kind of neat linear fashion, with no stops to pick up diapers along the way, or to drop the kids at childcare, or to check on an elderly parent, or to volunteer at the food bank. And things work quite well, I guess, if you are that person, although I question even how many men's lives look like that today. It's maybe a bit of an old-fashioned or traditional idea of a masculine role, but nonetheless, that has remained kind of the central organizing principle behind how we organize our transportation systems, where we locate different kinds of zones within the city, how we set up our accessibility infrastructure where we think it needs to be and not needs to be. And so much research for decades has shown that, women's journeys through the city, women's balancing of work and domestic responsibilities and so on, means that their day-to-day lives look quite different than this typical urban male subject. So it's kind of mind-blowing when you just start to understand how deeply entrenched that idea is, and how for a long time very few people have really questioned it. It's become so naturalized and so common sense that we don't often step outside of that and say, oh, could things be different?
Mm-hmm.
And what would that look like?
Yeah. I also wanted to ask you how the economy plays a role into this. And hearing you speak, it gives me the feeling that maybe the economy plays a big role in this, as it is centered in the way we structure the world, instead of centering our lives within the planning of cities and etc. Am I right, or?
Absolutely. What we typically think of as the economy is the world of paid work, right? The world of so-called production. And everything that allows that to happen, as some people put it, the work that lets work happen and the work that creates workers, is kind of disregarded, and it's disregarded in city planning to a huge extent. And what I mean is care work, both the care work that happens in the home, usually for free, still disproportionately done by women, and also paid care work that is underpaid, undervalued, and even stigmatized in many ways, and is done by a feminized and racialized workforce in so many cities around the world. we don't tend to think of that work as part of the economy. And in fact, early on in the pandemic, it was like a kind of for so many people, a mind-blowing moment of like, oh, wait, this work is essential. And now all of a sudden we have this category of essential workers. Now we're still not paying them more, and we're still not really supporting the things that they need, like paid sick leave and good transportation systems and all of those kinds of things. But suddenly we have this new label for it. So yes, the way that we think about the economy is very much tied to gender and gender roles, and that has an impact on how we organize our urban spaces.
Yeah. Enaam, I see you nodding. Do you want to add something?
I completely agree with what Leslie has been saying, and especially around the unpaid care work, but also our essential workers. I mean, we're calling them essential for a reason, right? They are the oil for the rest of the machine, and if we don't have that, then the economy basically can't function. As simple as that, because your economy is based on people working and producing and creating value. That is the essence of it. And if we have half of our workforce that also disproportionately is taking care of the new generation of workers, then we're losing out on a big part of that value that can be created. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that not all women do want to work as in the labor force and want to keep taking care of their children, and that should also be taken into account, and that should also be something that should be possible as well.
En de muzikale intermezzo wordt vandaag verzorgd door Heavenly. Heavenly is een opkomende artiest uit de omgeving Amsterdam-Almere en een echte verhalenverteller. Zij zet haar gevoelens en ervaringen om in melodieën die ons allemaal verblijden, althans wel mij. Zij vertolkt vandaag haar nummer Real One. Give it up for Heavenly.
I need a real one, somebody that just wanna hold me for me. I need a real one, yeah, somebody that just wanna hold me, I just want your affection, no I don't want it perfect, I don't need your attention, but no I just wanna have it, I just need a real one, hey, somebody for me. For me, for me, for me. On that side of my mind there's a truth. Can you see through my lies, baby? I can hide, I can guard all of you. But then you find you want a bad bitch you can kick it with, and I put money on top. Well, I ain't that bad bitch, I don't do no faulting, I got busy shits that I run. You wanna spoil me, wanna hold me, I don't sell these, can control these, don't want no cross-eyed nigga, I want a boss-ass nigga. You know that I like to play along, you want this shit just like how I run. You wanna taste, go ahead, babe, this is your rap, but this my intimidated, oh babe, I'll come. You know that's just the shit that I love. Go ahead, get yourself out of, cause I want you to prove me wrong, cause I need a real one, somebody that just wanna hold me for me, yeah. I need a real one, yeah, somebody that just wanna hold me, I just want your affection, no I don't want it perfect, I don't need your attention, but no I just wanna have it, I just need a real one, yeah, somebody for me, for me, for me, for me. And mine and Lyle is still going strong, it feels so right, that's why I'm holding on. We that's what you promised me. You know exactly what to do to me. I understand just how much I could feel. And you know what's right, you know what's real. Something so good that I wanna receive it. So good that I wanna believe it. Yeah. Wanna hold me, real, yeah. Wanna hold me. I just want your affection. No, I don't want it perfect. I don't need your attention, but no, I just wanna have it. I just need a real one, yeah. Somebody for me, 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 for me. For me, 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 for me.
I wanted to go
I agree.
towards your work, because you're an innovation manager at a bank and you studied development economics. And your work is centered around creating more equity, for instance, for poor farmers in certain areas of the
Yeah.
world. Is it right? Am I introducing
Yeah,
me right? Okay.
it is.
So I was reading up a little bit about development economics and wondering, and also just, I had this aha awareness thinking, oh, okay, I didn't know that that existed. Could you maybe also tell our viewers what it actually is? Because it's, fascinating actually.
Yeah, so I only stumbled upon the field of development economics actually after I started working within the innovation space at the bank that I'm currently at. So with development economics, we focus on the economies of developing countries and developing societies. That is it in a sentence. So a lot of the economic models that we have and that we're familiar with work well to a certain extent in our developed economies, in Europe, in North America, in Canada. But the realities are very different when we go into emerging countries and economies. And why they're different has to do with a lot of different things. But I think the essence of it, it's the different way of how people live and the different cultures and how certain things that we think are inefficiencies are embedded in those societies, but also the priorities that a lot of these families have in emerging countries are very different. Not too long ago, I did a talk on climate change, and while it's impacting emerging countries actually already now the most, it doesn't seem to be a high priority for a lot of the populations within these countries. And that's not because it's not important, it's because they have more short-term problems to think of. They have to think of what they're feeding their children this evening or tomorrow. And that is a whole different way of dealing with people, but also developing countries. And then, I mean, actually the development of the countries. So it's a small example for that is getting children vaccinated is often the task of a mother. A mother also has to work sometimes and get water for her children and walk over 10 kilometers back and forth to be able to do that. And even though that there might be free vaccinations available within the village that she's part of, she won't go to give her child a vaccination. So how then do you incentivize these parents to actually do that? And for example, already very small things such as giving them, next to the vaccination, giving them a kilogram of lentils already increases the uptake of vaccinations by 50%. right? So it's a whole different way of how we can tackle these kind of challenges that we have as a world.
Would it be fair to say that you take into account what the practices are and the culture is and what the people need, and then you try to find a way to make everything work? Would it be fair to say that when you look at, for instance, the Netherlands, that we've kind of forgotten to do that nowadays?
I do feel that's the case. So, for example, in innovation, it's very much rooted within the practice that we talk a lot with our potential customers and with our customers, because the product or whatever solution you're creating, it has to take up their needs. It needs to fulfill some kind of pain or create some kind of gain for these customers. In development economics, we do similar things, right? We do experiments. I think one of the most known development economist Nobel Prize winners, Esther Duflo, and her partner, they actually won a Nobel Prize for doing randomized controlled trials, which came from medicine, right? It's very intuitive for us to do A/B testing in medicine, test like giving a group a placebo and giving a group the actual medicine and see, what are the effects that each of them generate. We do similar things in development economics, and I think it could also very much benefit us on day-to-day, especially on city level, but potentially also on country level, and talk more with the people within our cities, and in this case, more with women and marginalized communities, and really taking that feedback up, and to do trials and to understand, okay, what is going well, what is not going well, but also understanding the limitations of that when you try to extrapolate, because what might work in Amsterdam might not work in Utrecht, or in a whole different country and city. So that external validity of that test or that feedback is very important as well.
Yeah, because I think that's something that often happens. We see something working elsewhere, and then we try to implement it in another place, thinking that would be the solution. When thinking about Amsterdam and the economy here in Amsterdam, what are the major issues that you see?
I think a big part of what we see in Amsterdam revolves around one, gentrification, which is becoming more and more of an issue. The incredibly high housing prices, I think, are very important as well, which means that our essential workers that we just talked about barely can afford to live in the city, even though they might be teaching in that school, or they might be doctors in the hospital in that city. Beyond that, I think what is also incredibly important is the safety within our cities. That plays a big role, especially during, I think, winter months. It becomes dark really early, and it can be a burden and a hassle for a lot of especially women and girls, whether that is because they do part-time jobs after their school, or whatever it might be. But these are some of the elements that are that I think in Amsterdam
Yeah, yeah.
play a big role.
Clarice also spoke to some people also about gentrification here in Amsterdam, especially in Amsterdam North. Leslie, you're currently writing a book about gentrification. What is the biggest problem, would you say, with gentrification? Because I think often a lot of people don't understand why it can be, why it's such a big problem. Because it entails more than just people not being able to find a house in a certain area. People can always go say, yeah, well, then you find a house elsewhere. But that also brings on other elements and other issues.
Yes, well, what we're talking about here is the process of displacement, where people either can't find somewhere to live or they're being pushed out of their neighborhoods. And there's so many different ways that this can happen. I think in cities like Amsterdam, for example, from what I've read, the growth of the tourist economy is also a factor in this. So the rise of things like short-term rentals and Airbnbs kind of pulling apartments and homes out of the regular rental and housing market and gearing them towards tourists. This means that there's a lower supply, lower vacancy rates, and then higher prices. So ordinary people, as Enaam said, can't afford to live there. We also have the situation where as neighborhoods change in terms of what kinds of shops are located there, what social services are there, who are the other people on the street, what languages are they speaking or not speaking, what is the kind of culture of the area. And sometimes as this changes through gentrification, people, even when they stay in their homes, can feel displaced. They no longer feel welcome. You know, in reading about people's experiences around the world, people will say things like, you know, I used to walk down the street and everyone would say hello to me, and now nobody speaks to me, right? Or I used to go and get my coffee at this bakery every morning and I knew everybody there, and now it's a Starbucks and I don't know anyone there. And so these changes that maybe don't seem like, you know, a massive forced removal of people or the demolition of housing, they do also have an impact on people's quality of life, how they understand how they belong in the city. And it kind of has intergenerational effects as well, because many people have histories of displacement in their communities, in their ethnic group, religious group, and so on. And it kind of goes into the future where people say, oh, I've lived in this neighborhood my whole life, but now my children and grandchildren can't afford to live here. So we can also think of it kind of temporally as having these long-term effects. I think from a feminist perspective, there's also gendered impacts in that women are often more likely to be displaced. They are, you know, we still have a wage gap in most places. Women are more likely to be the head of single parent families, and so, you know, responsible for children and needing greater affordability in housing. So it's also a gender issue when we think about the impacts of gentrification.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that it can also lead to this stacking of other issues. For instance, I spoke to a woman a few weeks ago, and she was being pushed out of Rotterdam, the city I'm from, and her son was going to be the first one in the family to go to the university, but now it would become an issue if they couldn't live in Rotterdam because they need to pay for transportation, and that's quite expensive, too expensive for them actually. So that way you can create this stack of issues that isn't really necessary if people can just live in the area they want to live. Yeah. So we've now established a notion of what is wrong with the world, a small bit. But as I said in the introduction, also we would like to move towards creating an actual perspective towards which cities like Amsterdam can work to create a more sustainable and equal world where there is space for everyone in it. Leslie, to come back also to your last book, throughout history, women and other marginalized groups have been calling for safer and more accessible streets. For instance, there has been the Reclaiming the Night movement in the UK, which started in Leeds way back, in which women demanded to be able to move around in the streets. Do you have any idea of why we as a society still haven't succeeded? We talk about claiming space, reclaiming space in this man-made world, and we discuss about it, but I still feel that we haven't really moved forward.
I agree. I think that the fact that, rates of violence against women all around the world have not really shown any sign of decreasing, and that women in cities everywhere report harassment, experiences of fear, and being made to feel unwelcome in public spaces. We could sort of do a deep dive into why that is. I think there's lots of reasons, one of which might be that we do still have the idea in many places that women belong in the home, and that we are kind of, as a society, invested in keeping that status quo. And one of the ways that we do that is by reminding women that they're not really welcome in public space and in the paid workplace. I think it's also to do with ideas about masculinity that we have, we've maybe done a fairly good job in some places of changing ideas about what it means to be a woman and opening the horizons of gendered opportunities for women, but we haven't necessarily tackled masculinity in the same way, and what it means to be a man, and the kinds of acceptable and unacceptable behaviors for men. So I think we have a lot of kind of education that we need to do there. And I also think that the kinds of quote unquote solutions that we've come up with to problems of violence and safety have been place too much emphasis on policing and on criminal punishment systems, which really have not made any kind of meaningful dent in violence against women, especially since so much of that violence occurs in private spaces of the home. And so as we're pouring literally billions and billions of dollars of resources into policing and prisons, we're not putting those resources into housing and childcare, healthcare, well-paying jobs, all of the kinds of things that would actually give women an opportunity to take more control of their lives and to avoid violence as much as possible.
Yeah. I can also imagine that while writing your last book, that you somehow envision what this ideal feminist city should look like. What would your ideal world look like? Or maybe even there are some places in the world that could lead, it could be some sort of example for this world.
Well, I would probably need several hours to lay out a full vision, but maybe I'll just highlight a few things that I think are really important. So one would be around issues of accessibility. So creating a more physically accessible urban environment is a gender issue, is a feminist issue, but it also interconnects with disability, with aging, with parenting, and other forms of care work in society. So if we can, literally open things up, then this provides a really, important avenue for widening the notion of who is the public and who gets to belong. Kind of related to that is questions about mobility. So I think for a feminist city, we need to ensure that there is green, affordable, and effective public transportation systems that do more than take people from the residential zone to the central business district in 9-to-5 patterns, but that connect different neighborhoods of the city in different ways. In terms of safety, I think we, as I said, we need to have a real radical rethink of kind of where we pour our resources into, and to start thinking about what are some of the things that we need to reinvest in that would create kind of safety from the ground up for more people. And housing, I think, is also, we've already talked a little bit about housing, but it's a fundamental element to me of the feminist city that there has to be affordable, suitable, centralized housing that's available to people, and that is not purely there for the purpose of making money for other people. Housing has to be more than an investment and profit-making vehicle. It has to be where people live. And lastly, I'll just say we need to kind of build care work into the infrastructure of the city. And maybe in a little while, we can talk a bit more about what that would actually look like. But instead of kind of care work being pushed as an afterthought or no thought at all in urban planning? What if we started from the roles of care workers? What if we started from the premise that we're all interdependent on one another, we all require care, and we should all perform care? How would that transform our cities?
It sounds like very necessary, but also quite radical things to change. In a bit, I would like to talk a little bit more about how we can make the world actually do all these things. But before we go into that, Enaam, I wanted to ask you a similar question when it comes to the economy. What would your ideal world look like when specifically looking at the economy and maybe also zooming in a little bit on Amsterdam?
I think the most essential part would be for us to really create solutions around parenting and childcare. And maybe that's also something that has to do with the employers within the city and beyond. But it would, I think, create a huge advantage for the economy and also for women specifically if, for example, there would be childcare at the place that she would be working or nearby at affordable rates, more affordable than they are right now, because it is a big part of our lives and the lives of parents, and especially women. So I think that is something that is incredibly important. I think another element thereof that is connected to it, and I think especially important in Amsterdam, is schooling. You see, especially when it comes to high schools, that there is this movement towards a few high schools that, you know, have better reputations or, you know, do things a little bit differently, and you see kind of like a brain drain from other schools and other districts. While if we would make sure that schools are up to par and have better quality altogether, then that would be less of a hurdle for a lot of people. And then lastly, and I think Leslie already mentioned that earlier, tourism is of course a huge part for Amsterdam, but it's also an element that is creating a lot of, you know, unwanted externalities and side effects for the city and for the people that live there, that has a huge impact on our economy. So we have a lot of benefits from it, but at the same time, it has these negative effects that we should take seriously as well.
Yeah, maybe I'm a bit pessimistic, but somehow it feels as if the past few years, everything has only been going downhill when it comes to creating a more equal world for everyone. And well, at the start of the pandemic, I remember there were a lot of people saying, well, never waste a good crisis, in a negative way, but also in a positive way. This is the moment for change. Now that we know who our essential workers are, now that everything has come to a pause, we can look at society and pinpoint all the difficult parts and then implement change. But somehow that didn't happen. We're like a year and a half later, and we're still looking at the same world and the same. The economy is still centered, and the ways of the world are the ways of the world. And I was wondering, is it even possible to change these systems? Is it something, you know, while we're talking about it and creating these beautiful perspectives, but do you both believe that we can actually make a difference? Enaam, to start off with you.
So I would want to believe that we can make that change, right? It's not easy to make that change, but I would like to believe that we can. But to be able to do it, and that's the difficulty when working on such huge systematic elements is that you will need the backing up of the communities on the ground, but you will also need policymakers, and you will need the private sector, and you will need grassroots organizations all working together to be able to make that change. But what you see what you see more and more is that we have this trend within the Netherlands, but also in Europe, where right-wing policies are gaining more and more traction, or already in power for a while, which don't support these kind of changes, right? Because um, it, the incentives are not aligned. They're not aligned on a top level for companies and employers. So with what we need as a society and community, and because of that, the policymakers are not making it match. So here the question is, how can we make sure that we align all of these different incentives so that everybody can benefit from this new change, and this new paradigm, if you would like to call it as such, from moving away from a capitalistic, male, cisgendered focus to a more inclusive one, where we have equity and housing for everybody, and nobody's living in poverty, and all of these other elements that we would like to facilitate as well.
Yeah, but it would take those cisgendered males to maybe give up a little bit of their power to be incentivized to want that change. Leslie, are you as pessimistic as I am, or do you believe that change is going to come?
Oh, I certainly believe that change is going to come. I think we have to believe that, even if we don't necessarily know exactly what the end point looks like. I think we learn about what we want and need along the way, through the process of the struggle, through the process of change. And I also think it's encouraging to, look to the fact that even, say, during the pandemic, we just said, okay, well, we haven't seen these, radical social, societal level changes yet. But at the same time, there are community level, there are grassroots things that are happening and were happening before the pandemic, and kind of, maybe exploded a bit more during the pandemic. Wherever there's a problem, people are already working on it. And I think this is what's really neat about this idea of a grassroots feminist New Deal, is to not assume that we need an expert, even necessarily someone like myself or Enaam, to say this is what we have to do, but to actually look and see what people are already doing, right? That the work is already happening in communities. And those are the places that I look to when I want to see some hope. When I think about, the rise of ideas like mutual aid and the Black Lives Matter movement, teaching us different ways to imagine what community safety and accountability look like. When I, think about the ways in which, women work together to keep each other safe, or to provide for their own daily needs with one another. I think, the work is already happening. We can't put all of our eggs in the basket of the state, of corporations and so on, because we'll be waiting a really long time, I think, if we wait for that to happen.
Yeah. So Clarice already spoke to several grassroots organizations, and we were talking about also, like, is change going to be top down or like bottom up? And within those talks, the feeling was really that the grassroots organizations are the ones that can carry that change. How do you feel about that, Enaam?
I think the work that these grassroots organizations are doing is incredibly important, and might be the catalyst for huge or bigger change. But at the same time, I believe if we want to change things systematically, we will need at some point to bring all of these other stakeholders together. But it doesn't mean that because I completely agree with Leslie, you know, a lot of the work has already been done. So if you go back to that like innovation mentality, a lot of the things that we need to do are already there on the ground, and we know what needs to change to make them happen. We just need to do it, and we need to go and gather that information and then implement those elements. So it, you know, it depends on how big do you want to create that change, right? At a certain point, you want to grow that bigger and bigger and make that scale. And that is where I believe we need to make sure that all different stakeholders get on board and we can push it forward.
Mhm. Yeah, thinking about change and the past few years, I also feel that we need society to back us up, or to back the grassroots organizations up. Is there a way in which we can tell the world and actually really make them see why it's so present that that this change is going to happen, and that we need a different world? Leslie.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly whether it's a crisis like the pandemic or climate change that's, you know, hurtling towards us so rapidly, as Enaam pointed out earlier, that people will need to start to see that we just literally cannot keep doing things the way that we have been doing them. Some of us, you know, in the global north who have more privilege have kind of a longer time horizon before we start to feel the pain of some of these changes, or we're more protected by certain forms of privilege and so on. But it's coming for all of us, right? So we have to start understanding that if we don't change the way that we live quite radically, whether that, you know, involves a radical rethinking of care work, as I've been talking about, whether that involves sustainability, and of course it involves both and more, and equity, and combining those things together, not thinking about them as separate or competing projects, but seeing that they are all deeply intertwined, then, you know, at a certain point, we kind of don't have a choice anymore to debate whether we can do these things. So it's in everybody's best interest to say, what can we do right now before we're at a point of kind of complete societal and economic collapse, when it will be too late to do any of these things.
Yeah, you've told us that you've already spoken with a lot of people around the world, and you've spoken to architects and people in the field. What are the responses to your book, but also your ideas and also other people's ideas about what this world could look like?
Well, I like to think there's been positive response. People are kind of hopeful and maybe encouraged when they're offered a sense of a different way of doing things, or in some cases kind of just a mindset shifts about what they prioritize in the work that they do, and seeing that those things can have an impact. So I think that's hopeful, but people also are can be frustrated by the constraints. So we think, oh, an architect gets to design this building and they, you know, have all of this power. But no, I mean, they are funded by, you know, the corporation that's paying for them to do the work, or the city. There's all sorts of regulations about what they can and can't do, and they're very constrained, as are city planners. So there, I think is hopefulness, but maybe coming up against some of the limitations that have been built into the system is difficult for people who I think genuinely do want to make people's lives better, right? They go into these professions because they want to see things improve, and often they're kind of, you know, held back from doing everything that they can do. So it might be part of a process of kind of empowering people to, you know, make as much change as they possibly can within their fields, but recognizing that it's not all about just those people doing that work, but like all of us need to be involved in our own areas of work and expertise to help create a wider change.
Yeah, you're kind of coming back also to what Enaam said in the beginning about the biases, for instance, in algorithms. They're not necessarily made to piss off women, but it happens. It's a bias unconsciously often. Enaam, is there anything else that you would like to add to today's talk? Some ideas, some thoughts that you would like to share with the world about Amsterdam and the economy?
I think I second Leslie's words. Everybody's contribution is incredibly important when it comes to making a change and changing things. So it can be as easy as sending a letter to your municipality, with a few other people, because you think something needs to change in your street, or because something else needs to happen. Like these kind of small acts that often we feel are not contributing enough or aren't big enough actually can make big change happen. With that, just keep on doing the good work, and we're doing it together, and everybody in their own way, and that is the most important part. And hopefully, we get to see a different paradigm in our lifetime.
Yeah. And Leslie, to finish off with you, is there anything you would like to add?
Well, I think I would say that despite all of the problems that we might point to in cities, I think are also sites of great potential for social change. They've, historically been sites of great social movements, important struggles, and I think, that continues, right? We can point to all of the kind of anti-progressive things that are happening, but we also have to recognize that there are still movements going on every day, and they do make a difference. Sometimes it's not the immediate, wholesale shift that we would hope for, but those incremental changes do matter. And so I think we do have to keep reminding people that using your voice, using what power that you have, and using it collectively, right? Coming together with other people who think and feel the same way, or who have similar needs, or who you just want to stand in solidarity with, even if your experience is different, that coming together is powerful, and people do listen, and change, does come over time. So, cities, I think, are still key sites for those struggles and for change to happen. And in some ways, even though I said, okay, well, we don't want to rely for everything on the state, I do think that cities are often somewhat more progressive than their national contexts that they're located in. So they can also be places to push for changes, whether that's changes to policing, for example, changes in housing policy, pushing for universal basic income, rent control, living wages, childcare, schooling. Like cities aren't in charge of all of that, but they can push for that, and they can implement some of those things themselves. So the city can be a great kind of scale, if you will, for political action that makes a real difference in people's day-to-day lives.
Yeah, wow, amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much also for finishing off with a positive note, because I believe that the reason a lot of people like living in a city is because we can find our peers here, and even when we might not always have the same background or history, or don't necessarily live the same way, but still this like-mindedness that joins us. Yeah. Well, that was it already. Thank you both so much for joining me today, Dr. Leslie Kern and Enaam Ahmed Ali. And thank you all also at home watching us today. Thank you to Felix Meritis, of course, for hosting this place, and the technicians. Thank you so much for your amazing job. Thank you to my crew, Gitka, who's also here backstage, and Aida and Isabel and Clarice. Thank you so much for helping me out. I would like to tell you all to keep an eye out on our website for the articles and the productions, as well as the code for the future. And if you haven't already, you can check out the previous events. You can find them on our website, on our Instagram page, or on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to give each other and yourself but especially us some extra love by becoming our friend or our friend with benefits, or maybe even give us or make us a donation to make sure we can do these kinds of events more often. Thank you so much. My name is Hasna El Maroudi and hope to see you soon.